What if everything you were taught about Jesus was just the surface, just a sliver of a far greater, deeper truth that's been hidden in plain sight? What if the man known as the Christ wasn't merely born in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, but had walked the earth countless times before that moment? Each life a sacred step toward the divine mission he came to fulfill? This is not just another story of faith, it's a journey through time, space, and soul evolution, a vision that stretches far, beyond the walls of traditional doctrine, one that invites us to see Jesus not only as a figure of worship, but as the living blueprint of what the human soul is capable of becoming. And at the heart of this astonishing perspective is the man often called the sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce. Through hundreds of trance readings, Cayce revealed a version of Jesus that many churches never dared to speak of, an eternal soul known as Emilius, who descended willingly into the cycles of earth to guide humanity back to its divine origin. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the globe. Now imagine this for a moment. Jesus' life wasn't a one-time miracle. It was the result of countless incarnations, each one a step toward remembering his oneness with the Creator. Cayce tells us that long before the manger, before the cross, before the miracles in Galilee, there was a soul who saw that many others had lost their way, trapped in material desire, cut off from their divine source. And so, this soul chose to enter the human experience again and again, to become the light that could lead others home. Have you ever felt that there's more to your existence than what you've been told? That beneath the layers of daily life, there's a deeper calling, a sense that your soul has traveled far to be here? If so, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might just confirm everything you've ever quietly suspected about your own spiritual path. According to Cayce, Jesus' mission wasn't just to redeem humanity, but to reflect the divine potential sleeping within each of us. He wasn't sent from above to fix something broken. He emerged from within the very fabric of the human journey, a soul who never lost his connection to the Creator, no matter how many lifetimes he lived. And that, perhaps, is the most radical idea of all, that Jesus' greatness wasn't a gift from the heavens, but a victory earned through lifetimes of conscious alignment with divine will. But if that's true, if Jesus walked this earth not once, but many times before becoming the Christ, what does that mean for us? For our own souls? For the purpose of our struggles, our choices, our growth? Stay close, because in the next part, we'll uncover the ancient identity of Emilius, explore the spiritual dimensions Cayce spoke of, and begin to trace the astonishing path that led one soul through the ages, until he became the man the world would one day call Jesus. Most of us grew up with a clear-cut image of Jesus, divine, untouchable, a being so far beyond us that all we could do was kneel in reverence. But what if that image, however comforting, was only a fragment of something far more profound? What if the true story wasn't about placing him on a pedestal, but about recognizing that the same divine essence he embodied is quietly pulsing within each of us? Edgar Cayce wasn't trying to tear down belief. He was trying to peel back the layers, to expose what had been hidden beneath centuries of doctrine, fear, and tradition. His insights weren't about discrediting Jesus. Quite the opposite. They were about showing how vast, how deeply cosmic, that soul truly was. Not a detached savior sent to fix the fallen, but a fellow traveler who had walked the hardest paths before us, again and again, choosing love over power, humility over control. This is where it gets interesting. Cayce didn't describe Jesus as an isolated miracle. He saw him as the result of a journey, an evolution of consciousness. Reincarnation wasn't just a spiritual theory, it was the backdrop of Jesus' unfolding. He wasn't created to be perfect. He became perfect through choices, lifetimes, and transformation. That idea changes everything, because if he was forged through experience, then so are we. And if he reached the heights of divine unity through that process, what's stopping us from doing the same? Suddenly, the life of Jesus stops being a sacred exception and starts becoming a spiritual map, a guide for navigating this strange and beautiful thing we call life. We stop asking, "How can I be saved?" and start asking, "How can I remember who I truly am?" And that shift, from dependence to awakening, changes our mindset completely. It's not about measuring up to an unreachable ideal. It's about rediscovering the spark that's always been there, buried beneath the noise of the world. That's the part that stirs something deep, isn't it? This isn't just about theology or religion. It's about identity, about reclaiming the parts of ourselves we were told to ignore. The mystical, the intuitive, the eternal. Jesus wasn't just a teacher, he was a mirror. Cayce's readings present him as someone who knew who he was and who we are. He didn't hoard that truth, he lived it, radiated it, and invited others to remember it within themselves. And maybe that's why, so much of what Cayce revealed feels like a challenge as much as a revelation. It pushes us out of the comfort zone of passive belief and into the fire of active transformation. It asks, are you ready to stop watching and start remembering? Are you willing to look at your own journey and see the echoes of something divine moving through your choices, your pain, your growth? Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, not just into who Jesus was, but how this forgotten truth reshapes everything we think we know about soul evolution, divine purpose, and our connection to something far greater than we've been taught. Write in the comments, I'm also on this path, long before the name Jesus was ever spoken. Before the star over Bethlehem ever rose in the sky, there was a soul, brilliant, ancient, conscious, known as Amelius. According to Edgar Cayce, this wasn't just a poetic metaphor or spiritual symbol. Amelius was real, a radiant being, existing in a dimension beyond form, before time as we know it even began. He was among the first creations, born of divine thought, a pure extension of Source. But what makes this story so powerful isn't just where it begins, it's what this soul chose to do. In the higher realms, Cayce explains, souls existed as light, as thought, as pure energy in complete harmony with the Creator. But over time, many became curious. Drawn toward experience, sensation, and self-expression, they began to drift away from the unified mind of God. Not out of the rebellion, but out of exploration, a cosmic decision that would change everything. This descent into matter, into individuality, into physical reality, caused many souls to forget their divine origin. They got lost in the illusion of separation, pulled into the gravity of desire, fear, ego, and it was in the face of this unraveling that Amelius made his choice. Not to escape, not to rise above, but to enter in, to descend into the very density that had pulled others away, to walk among those who had forgotten who they were, and to serve as a bridge back to divine remembrance. This decision wasn't about saving in the way we're used to hearing. It was about guiding, about embodying a pattern, a map, a living vibration that could reawaken what had been lost. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this moment, this soul's choice to come into form, wasn't just a personal mission. It was the beginning of something vast and transformational. It was the start of a sacred blueprint, not just for Jesus, but for every soul who would one day ask, "Why am I here?" and "What am I meant to become?" That's the hidden truth embedded in this story. That the path Amelius began isn't reserved for the holy or the chosen. It's woven into the potential of every being brave enough to remember. This shifts everything we think we know about destiny, purpose, and the challenges we face. Because if one soul could choose to re-enter the realm of suffering, forgetting, and limitation, purely to help others remember their light, then every challenge we face might also carry hidden meaning. It reframes struggle as opportunity, pain as awakening, and life itself not as a test to survive, but as a journey designed for evolution. Each decision we make, each moment of clarity, each act of compassion becomes a thread in that same pattern, a reminder that even in a world clouded by fear and confusion, the light has never left. It's only waiting to be remembered, and that's where the impact begins to ripple outward, not in dramatic displays of holiness, but in the subtle choices of everyday life, the way we forgive, the way we serve, the way we choose love over pride. These are echoes of Amelius still moving through time, quiet, persistent, divine. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." The moment Emilius chose to descend into matter, something profound was set into motion. It wasn't just about stepping into the physical world, it was about entering a realm where memory fades, where clarity dims, and where the soul must rediscover its purpose in the thick of illusion. Even a soul as luminous as his could not bypass the veil. In this dense human experience, forgetting was part of the process. And that's the part most people miss, that even the ones who come to guide must also remember. This descent wasn't punishment, it was opportunity. Cayce describes it as a sacred refinement, a transformation that couldn't happen in the spirit world alone. Earth, with all its chaos and contradiction, offered something the celestial realms did not: the pressure needed to awaken true power. Here, choices matter. Mindset matters. Every decision becomes a reflection of who you're becoming. And for the soul that would one day be called Jesus, this wasn't a straight line toward perfection. It was a spiral of learning, falling, rising again, always moving closer to divine union. We often imagine spiritual figures as flawless from the start, but what if the truth is more inspiring than that? What if their greatness wasn't in their perfection, but in their persistence, in their willingness to keep showing up, lifetime after lifetime, through challenge and shadow, until their light became unshakable? That hidden truth, the one most traditions are afraid to admit, is that divinity isn't gifted, it's cultivated. And in Cayce's view, Jesus' soul cultivated it through experience, through humility, through a willingness to walk through every fire we fear. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because once you see this not as mythology but as soul history, it reshapes how you view your own path. Think about it. If even the Christ had to go through trial, confusion, and long passages of remembrance, what does that say about your current season of life? That moment when everything feels unclear, when your identity wavers, when your purpose seems distant. Maybe it isn't a sign you're lost. Maybe it's part of the pattern, the same one Emilius followed, the same one we're all tracing in our own way. There's something powerful about realizing you're not alone in that inner work, that behind the scenes of every soul's journey, there's a divine architecture quietly unfolding. Cayce's vision gives us permission to honor the struggle without shame, to stop pretending that awakening happens overnight. It doesn't. It's layered, it's messy, and yet, in the midst of it, something extraordinary is forming, a consciousness strong enough to carry light into the darkest places. And that's what makes this story not just historical or symbolic, but personal. Because if the soul of Jesus had to remember who he was over and over again, then maybe the same grace applies to you. Maybe your path isn't about having all the answers, but about trusting the unfolding, about allowing your experiences, the highs, the doubts, the breakthroughs, to shape you into something sacred. Put down, "I'm also on this path." If we allow ourselves to set aside the rigid lines of traditional doctrine for just a moment, what begins to emerge is a far more dynamic, transformative version of spiritual evolution, one that invites the soul into a story so much larger than a single lifetime could ever hold. That's the landscape Edgar Cayce leads us into, a place where the soul of Jesus doesn't just appear, perfected, from a divine realm, but unfolds gradually through time, carrying the wisdom, the wounds, and the revelations of many human lives. What Cayce describes isn't about sin and punishment. It's about growth, about a consciousness learning how to anchor divine light into human form again and again. His readings speak of incarnations not as corrections, but as refinements. Each life, each experience, a thread in the weaving of a soul designed to become the pattern for awakening. It's not about falling from grace, it's about climbing back to it, with awareness, compassion, and depth. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the names Cayce reveals are not just historical, they're symbolic. They represent distinct stages of spiritual maturity, each one revealing something essential about the journey toward divine embodiment. Imagine the soul who would one day walk the shores of Galilee once lived as Adam, the origin point, the first breath of human self-awareness. Then as Enoch, the mystic who walked so closely with God, he was said to transcend death itself. Later Melchizedek, the priest-king whose presence was so profound he existed outside of lineage and law. Then Joseph, the dreamer and interpreter, whose inner vision saved a nation. And finally, Zerubbabel, the rebuilder of the temple, a life devoted to restoration, renewal, and sacred structure. These weren't random incarnations, they were initiations, experiences carefully chosen to embody the spectrum of what it means to be both human and divine. Each life shaped the soul. Each choice, each sacrifice, each awakening layered another dimension of understanding. And through it all, the memory of Source flickered like a hidden flame, never fully extinguished, always waiting to be reignited. It's tempting to view these stories as separate. Adam from one myth, Joseph from another, Melchizedek a mystery tucked between pages. But when you see them as aspects of the same evolving soul, something clicks. You realize that Jesus didn't arrive fully formed. He emerged. He emerged through lifetimes of leadership and humility, vision and service, trial and surrender. And that emergence is what makes his journey so powerful, not because it's unattainable, but because it mirrors our own. This reframing asks us to stop idolizing perfection and start honoring process. It nudges us to look at our own patterns, our own experiences, and ask, what am I becoming through this? What strength am I cultivating in this season of uncertainty? What part of me is being refined not for punishment, but for purpose? The lives Cayce names aren't just historical echoes, they're archetypes, keys to understanding how consciousness evolves when it stays committed to the divine, even through lifetimes of forgetting. And that's the invitation behind it all, to see your life not as a mistake to fix, but as a sacred unfolding. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." It's one thing to see familiar names from ancient texts as distant figures frozen in time: Adam, Enoch, Melchizedek, Joseph, Zerubbabel. But it's another thing entirely to realize that, through Cayce's lens, they may have all been expressions of a single soul, carrying out a long and intentional journey. That revelation alone changes everything. It collapses linear history into something more layered, more alive, more interconnected. It's no longer a line of holy men passing down wisdom. It's the same consciousness returning again and again to refine, to serve, to remember. This idea that the soul of Jesus evolved isn't meant to diminish him. On the contrary, it brings a kind of sacred closeness. We no longer have to see him as a being so far removed from our own struggles that we can only admire from a distance. In Cayce's view, the soul that became Jesus moved through the same human conditions we face: choice, confusion, ego, desire, sacrifice. And through it all, he didn't retreat from the world. He leaned into it. That's what made the Christ light so real in him. It wasn't untouched by suffering. It was forged through it. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what Cayce offers here isn't just a new way of understanding Jesus, it's a new way of understanding ourselves. We often think that spiritual awakening should feel like sudden lightning, like a voice from the clouds, or a blinding flash of clarity. But more often, it looks like this: a gradual becoming, a quiet decision, made over and over again to return to the truth of who you are, even when everything outside of you says otherwise. There's power in recognizing that divinity doesn't demand immediate perfection. It asks for willingness, it invites participation, and it honors the long road. That's what Cayce reveals behind the scenes of these incarnations. Not just moments of greatness, but moments of vulnerability, moments where the soul could have chosen comfort, but chose growth instead. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that the Christ was born perfect, but that he was willing to keep showing up until he remembered himself completely. We're used to being told that we're separate from that kind of spiritual power, that it lives in the past, or only within the chosen. But what if that's not true? What if the deeper message hidden within this evolutionary journey is that the soul of Jesus walked this road so that we would recognize our own, so that when we face the fire of transformation, we won't mistake it for failure. we'll see it as a sign that something sacred is forming inside us too. And this is where mindset shifts into something much more than personal development. It becomes soul development. It becomes a conscious choice to evolve beyond fear, to act with compassion, to trust the process, even when it's messy. That's the quiet revolution beneath Cayce's vision. It's not about escaping life. It's about engaging it so deeply that you remember why you came here in the first place. Put down, "I'm also on this path." There's something profoundly humbling in the idea that a soul could walk through the noise, distraction, and temptations of countless lifetimes, and still remain aligned with its divine source. According to Edgar Cayce, that's exactly what set Jesus apart. Not supernatural immunity to human experience, but the unwavering choice to stay connected. Life after life, in every role and circumstance, his soul kept turning back toward the light. That kind of loyalty to the divine, especially when surrounded by the chaos of earthly existence, isn't just rare, it's revolutionary. We tend to place holiness on a pedestal, as though it's some fixed state only a select few are born into. But what Cayce reveals is a different kind of power, one that isn't bestowed but remembered. Jesus in this vision isn't above us, he's ahead of us, not in hierarchy, but in evolution. His journey was the blueprint, not the exception. He wasn't sent to be worshipped for his uniqueness, but to demonstrate what becomes possible when the soul is fully awake, fully anchored, fully surrendered to divine will. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this shifts the conversation from theology to transformation. It forces us to ask more courageous questions about our mindset, about the hidden truth of who we are, about the quiet decisions we make every day that either move us closer to, or further from, that same inner connection. If a soul could preserve its bond with God through lifetimes of complexity, pain, and power, then maybe the divine spark within us is far more resilient than we've been led to believe. That's the impact of Cayce's message. It's not just informative, it's activating. You start to realize that Jesus didn't arrive to demand devotion, but to reflect potential. He lived the pattern, embodied the path, and in doing so, illuminated what it looks like to live as a soul, not just with one. In every encounter, every act of healing, every moment of forgiveness, he was modeling the inner mechanics of spiritual maturity. Not a doctrine to memorize, but a frequency to align with. And maybe that's the hidden reason why this story has survived for so long, not just in scriptures, but in the collective heart of humanity. Because deep down, there's a part of us that recognizes that pattern. It stirs something ancient inside, not a call to bow, but a call to rise, to remember, to participate. The more we see Jesus as a living mirror rather than a distant icon, the more we begin to reclaim the parts of ourselves we've forgotten. The parts that are strong, centered, compassionate, the parts that carry purpose. It's easy to think of spiritual evolution as something grand, something that happens in temples or mountaintops. But the truth is, it happens in quiet moments, in how we speak, in how we forgive, in how we return to stillness when the world feels loud. That's the path Cayce described, not reserved for saints, but accessible to every single soul willing to choose it. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." There's a sacred honesty in the idea that even a soul as exalted as Jesus had to learn through suffering, not because he was flawed, not because he was being punished, but because even the highest soul, when moving through the human experience, must engage with its weight, the friction, the resistance, the refining fire that strips away everything that is not truth. Cayce described this not as a fall from grace, but as a conscious initiation, a process of tempering the ego until the soul shines through without distortion. This completely shifts how we view pain, not as something to avoid at all costs, but as a portal, a place where illusions break down and something deeper emerges. Jesus didn't run from those moments. He leaned in. He allowed the human self to feel it all, the doubts, the temptations, the fear, so that he could align, not from detachment, but from choice. And that choice, made again and again across many lifetimes, is what Cayce says gave birth to the Christ within him. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because this idea of transformation through suffering isn't just poetic, it's foundational. In the modern world, we're constantly taught to numb pain, to label it as failure, to move past it as quickly as possible. But what if those exact moments, the heartbreaks, the losses, the personal storms, are actually the initiations of the soul? What if they're not interruptions to your spiritual path, but part of it? What if they're the very fabric through which the divine weaves your strength? This is what makes Jesus' journey so powerful in Cayce's vision. He didn't skip the hard parts, he walked through them deliberately, not to prove anything to the world but to master the interior landscape. And that's what sets him apart. Not supernatural powers, not religious status, but devotion to inner alignment no matter the cost. His miracles, his presence, his wisdom, they weren't magical tricks. They were the natural result of a consciousness so refined, so synchronized with divine law, that illusion had no place left to hide. And yet, what makes this story even more impactful is the reminder that he wasn't meant to be the exception. Cayce repeats this again and again. Jesus came not to be worshipped as untouchable, but to model what's possible. His greatness wasn't given, it was earned. And that's what makes it deeply human. He became what he became through the fire, through the forgetting, through the remembering, and so can we. This message quietly challenges everything. It doesn't demand dogma or blind belief. It invites participation. It shifts the spotlight from external salvation to internal awakening, and in doing so, it gives you back your power. It allows you to see your own suffering not as proof of separation, but as evidence that something holy is trying to emerge. It's an invitation to stop judging your journey by how smooth it looks, and start honoring it by how much it's teaching you. Put down, "I'm also on this path." The image of Jesus traveling across distant lands might sound poetic, even mythological, but through Cayce's lens, it was something far more grounded, something deeply intentional. This wasn't a journey of collecting foreign ideas for the sake of novelty or mystique. It was an initiation, a sacred undertaking designed to awaken every layer of his being. Each land, each temple, each encounter carried frequencies, symbols, and spiritual technologies that would become the foundation for something much greater than one tradition could hold alone. This path wasn't about abandoning his roots. It was about expanding them. Jesus didn't reject his Hebrew lineage. He deepened it. He took the essence of what had been passed down, devotion, covenant, prophecy, and infused it with a broader understanding of human potential. He didn't just memorize scripture, he lived its hidden meaning, and along the way, he recognized the same divine thread running through every culture he encountered. That's where his real mastery began, not in separating truth from belief, but in synthesizing the timeless wisdom beneath it all. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what this synthesis reveals is something many never consider, that spiritual truth is not exclusive property. It doesn't belong to any one nation, any one prophet, any one book. It's a frequency, a resonance that can be felt in the silent teachings of a desert mystic, in the chants of an Indian ashram, in the geometry of an Egyptian temple, or in the stillness of your own heart. Jesus saw this. He felt it, and he allowed it to reshape him from within. This mindset, this openness, is one of the most radical aspects of Cayce's Jesus. It shows us that wisdom is alive, that no path has a monopoly on awakening, and perhaps even more importantly, that true spiritual leadership isn't about preserving a system. It's about embodying a truth that transcends systems. Jesus became that embodiment, not because he clung to one ideology, but because he listened deeply to the message beneath them all, a message of unity, of remembrance, of divine origin. That's the hidden impact of this global journey. It wasn't an escape from his own culture. It was a return to a more complete version of it. By stepping into the sacred spaces of others, he didn't lose himself. He found the parts of himself that were already universal, and in doing so, he created a bridge, not just between East and West, but between heaven and earth, between the spiritual and the human, between knowing and being. This kind of journey requires incredible humility. It means unlearning relearning and surrendering the ego's need to be right in favor of something truer. Jesus didn't carry the attitude of, "I already know." He carried the posture of, "Let me remember more." That is the real model he left us, not one of authority, but of receptivity, not one of domination, but of integration, a spiritual intelligence that doesn't argue, but harmonizes. So when we look at his teachings, his parables, his healings, his silence, in the face of accusation, we're not seeing isolated acts. We're seeing the outflow of everything he integrated during that hidden journey. Every word he spoke was soaked in the mystery schools, the meditation halls, the sacred texts, and the stillness he encountered along the way. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Beneath the sands of Egypt, far beyond the gaze of tourists and textbooks, the Great Pyramid holds secrets few have ever fully grasped. According to Edgar Cayce, this monumental structure wasn't just a burial chamber or architectural marvel, it was a spiritual instrument, a temple of transformation, built with precision to awaken the deeper faculties of the soul. And Jesus, in the silence of his preparation years, entered this space not as a tourist, but as an initiate. This wasn't metaphorical. Cayce spoke of real initiatory rites that Jesus underwent within the pyramid's inner chambers, rituals designed not to impress, but to align. The body, the mind, the spirit, all brought into harmony, tuned like an instrument to higher frequencies. The energy of Giza, the geometry of the stones, the intention encoded into every corridor, it all served to refine the vessel that would carry the Christ consciousness into the world. This phase of his journey wasn't mystical theater, it was a disciplined calibration of divine awareness. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this alignment wasn't a solo endeavor. Behind every great transformation is a lineage, a web of souls quietly weaving support, guidance, and preparation. That's where the Essenes come in. This mystical Jewish sect, often hidden in the background of history, played a vital role in the story most never hear. Long before Jesus spoke to crowds or performed miracles, the Essenes were shaping the soil from which his mission would grow. They didn't operate in palaces or public temples. Their path was one of quiet devotion, sacred discipline, and deep metaphysical understanding. They believed in karma, reincarnation, purity of thought and body. And within their secluded communities, they were not only preparing for the arrival of the Messiah, they were actively cultivating the conditions necessary for his emergence. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was chosen and trained within this context. Her spiritual readiness wasn't incidental, it was intentional. This behind-the-scenes revelation reframes everything. It wasn't just that Jesus was special, it's that his environment was built to support the flowering of his purpose. Every layer of his early life, from his mother's consciousness to the teachers who guided him, was infused with preparation. And it challenges us to ask something bold. What if our own awakening depends just as much on what we surround ourselves with as it does on what we carry inside? The Essenes knew that spiritual power doesn't erupt, it unfolds, and it does so most powerfully in spaces where truth is nurtured, not forced. Jesus didn't become who he was overnight. He was shaped in silence, in sacred study, in ritual, and in the company of those who saw not the boy, but the light he was destined to carry. This realization isn't just historical, it's personal. It asks us to look at our own lives and ask, what am I aligning with? Who am I allowing to shape my inner world? What am I quietly preparing for that the world hasn't seen yet? Write in the comments, I'm also on this path. The deeper you go into the story beneath the story, the more you begin to see how nothing about Jesus' path was random. The wisdom he carried wasn't just born from revelation, it was distilled from lifetimes of soul experience, and further refined by teachings that stretched far beyond the borders of his own homeland. The Essenes, in particular, were a crucial thread in this sacred weave. Their principles, karma, soul memory, energetic purity, spiritual discipline, weren't fringe beliefs. They were foundational, and they echoed the very same truths Cayce would later uncover in his trance readings. These were not theoretical ideals for the Essenes. They were lived, daily rituals, cycles of inner cleansing, silence, reflection, intention, and it was inside this environment that Jesus matured. The child who would one day teach forgiveness to the world was raised within a tradition that saw forgiveness not as moral obligation, but as energetic liberation. The man who would later speak of the kingdom within first learned to access that kingdom through meditation, ritual, and the purification of thought. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this is where something truly remarkable begins to unfold. Cayce's portrayal of Jesus isn't just that of a teacher or prophet, it's that of a spiritual synthesizer, someone whose soul had absorbed the truths scattered across time, space, and tradition, and brought them back together into one radiant, unified message. He didn't claim ownership of wisdom, he embodied it, and in doing so, he reminded humanity of something ancient, something we had forgotten in the noise of power, control, and rigid doctrine. What Jesus taught wasn't new. That's the hidden truth so few realize. His words rang with the resonance of teachings that had echoed in India, Egypt, Persia, Tibet. The language was different. The metaphors were shaped for the ears of his time. But the essence was eternal. He wasn't building something from scratch. He was remembering something universal. And through him, that memory came alive again. This is why his message cut through people's hearts. Not because it was revolutionary, but because it was familiar. Something deep within the human spirit recognized it instantly. That longing for unity, for mercy, for healing. It was as if his presence activated something ancient in those who listened. A blueprint coded into the soul, suddenly awakened by the sound of truth spoken without fear. And perhaps that's what real spiritual power looks like. Not the ability to create new systems, but the courage to strip them away and return to the essence beneath them all. Jesus wasn't trying to start a religion. He was calling us back to something far older than religion, the remembrance of who and what we truly are. That we are not broken creatures begging for grace. We are fragments of the divine, slowly remembering our wholeness. Put down. This makes sense to me. When Jesus returned to Galilee after years of silence, study, and sacred preparation, he was not the same man who had left. On the surface, to many, he was still the carpenter's son, the familiar face from a small village. But inwardly, something extraordinary had taken root. He was no longer simply a man. He had become the embodiment of a cosmic principle. What Cayce described as the Christ wasn't a title bestowed by others. It was a state of consciousness he had fully awakened within himself. And that shift, quiet, invisible to the eyes of those not yet ready to see, was the result of a journey far greater than most could ever imagine. He wasn't just returning from a physical journey across distant lands, he was emerging from a profound internal transformation. Every cell of his being, every layer of his awareness, had been realigned with divine law. He didn't teach from memory. He taught from presence. He didn't heal from power. He healed from attunement. And it's this behind-the-scenes evolution that reveals the depth of who he really was. Not a man playing the role of a savior, but a soul who had walked through the full cycle of incarnation, suffering, forgetting, and remembering, and returned whole. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what Cayce revealed about Jesus reframes his story in a way that isn't just spiritual, it's deeply human. Jesus didn't bypass the process, he became through it. He entered this world again and again, evolving through lifetimes, refining his understanding of love, surrender, and truth, until his soul had no separation left. In Cayce's words, he completed the full cycle. He remembered fully who he was, who we are, and what it means to return to God. Not by escaping earth, but by embodying spirit within it. That return wasn't the end. It was a beginning, because Jesus didn't just come back in unity with God, he came back to show us how to get there too. Not as a distant idol to be adored, but as a living blueprint, a guide, a soul who had done the work, and now stood as a mirror for every other soul, still walking through the fires of their own becoming. It's easy to worship someone who seems untouchable, but to follow the footsteps of someone who earned their light through the same choices we face, that's different. That's vulnerable. That's empowering. It means that what he did wasn't a divine exception. It was an invitation. And that might be the most radical part of Cayce's vision, that the Christ is not locked away in one man, one church, one moment in history. It's a state of being that any soul can awaken when it's ready to rise through love, surrender, and truth. Jesus didn't come to prove he was different. He came to remind us we are the same, that we've simply forgotten. That the journey back isn't about pleasing an external force, but about remembering the force already alive within us. And every step he took, every teaching, every silence, every miracle, was a reflection of that inner knowing. Write in the comments, I'm also on this path. What Cayce reveals next strikes at the core of everything we think we know about divinity, that Jesus didn't become divine by escaping the human condition, but by fully embracing it, transforming it, and awakening within it. His achievement wasn't that he was other, but that he remembered before the rest of us did. He remembered what we've forgotten, that within every soul lives the same spark, the same light, the same seed of God. And through that remembering, he became a reflection of what is possible when a soul dares to walk all the way home. This is where the traditional image of Jesus begins to dissolve, and something far more powerful takes its place. Not a figure above humanity, but a soul ahead of it, not separated by some unreachable holiness, but bound to us through shared essence. Cayce's vision isn't about making Jesus less, it's about making us more, because when you see his life not as a divine exception, but as the result of lifetimes of alignment, surrender, and deep inner work, something inside shifts. You stop asking, could I ever be like him? And start asking, what part of me is already on that path? Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the phrase Christ consciousness isn't just spiritual poetry, it's a real state of awareness. It's what happens when a soul is no longer run by fear, division, or illusion. When the ego takes its proper place as servant, not master. When every thought, every action, every breath begins to reflect the unity between the Creator and creation. Jesus didn't claim that awareness as his alone. He lived it so fully that others could see their own reflection in him. That was his gift, not control, not dominance, but example. It's here where the hidden truth begins to unfold in ways that challenge almost everything we've been taught. Because if Christ consciousness is within us, then the journey isn't about waiting to be saved. It's about choosing to awaken. It's about shifting your mindset from being separate and small to being a vessel of something far greater than the personality. Jesus became the model, not because he had special access, but because he devoted himself completely to that remembering. He held nothing back, and that full surrender is what allowed divine will to move through him without resistance. This is not about claiming divinity and arrogance. It's about humbling ourselves to the realization that the same divine source flows through everyone. Cayce wasn't painting a picture of spiritual hierarchy. He was inviting us to look deeper at the stories we've been told, and to consider that the greatest miracle of all was not the resurrection, but the awakening, the internal transformation that allowed Jesus to embody heaven on earth. And so the question becomes not, was he the only one, but rather, what would happen if I lived from that same place? The potential is already there. The blueprint is intact. The pattern has been demonstrated. All that remains is the choice to step into it, not through striving, but through remembering. Write in the comments, this makes sense to me. When people talk about miracles, they often speak of them with a kind of awe-soaked distance, as if they were spectacles performed to prove something, to validate divinity through shock and wonder. But in Cayce's view, the miracles attributed to Jesus weren't exceptions to natural law. They were expressions of a deeper law most of us have forgotten: healing the sick, calming the sea, walking on water. These weren't demonstrations for applause. They were simply what happens when a being is in full alignment with divine truth. They were the natural outpouring of a consciousness no longer bound by illusion. Jesus didn't perform miracles to impress. He wasn't trying to gather followers through spectacle. The power flowed through him not because he claimed it, but because he had emptied himself of everything that blocked it. No fear, no pride, no separation. That's what made the impossible possible. not magic, but clarity, not manipulation of matter, but total surrender to spirit. And that kind of alignment didn't begin with miracles. It began in silence, in discipline, in the inner work that most people never see. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this is where the message becomes less about history and more about remembrance. Cayce made it clear, the Christ is not the exclusive property of any religion, time, or culture. It's a universal force, a consciousness that transcends labels and systems. And the moment we think it belongs to one group or one name, we lose touch with its essence. The Christ isn't a belief, it's a state. It lives wherever love overrides fear, wherever unity replaces division, wherever the soul remembers its source. And this changes everything, because if the Christ is not outside of us, if it's not something we must earn or prove or borrow, then we're not waiting to be saved. We're being invited to awaken, not to copy Jesus, but to embody what he embodied, to remember what he remembered. His miracles were never meant to separate him from us. They were meant to remind us of what's possible when we stop pretending to be less than divine. This hidden truth has been buried beneath centuries of control and confusion. Systems built to preserve power have tried to make the Christ into a fixed identity. One man, one moment, one religion. But Cayce's perspective cuts through all of that. It doesn't reject Jesus. It magnifies him, not by limiting his uniqueness, but by revealing the depth of his consciousness and the path he walked to reach it. That path is still open, not as a theological concept, but as an inner unfolding. It's not about agreeing with doctrine. It's about choosing to align, to shift the way we think, love, act, and perceive, to live in a way that reflects our true nature, not the smaller version we've been conditioned to accept. That's where transformation begins, not in the sky, but in the self. And every miracle Jesus lived was a byproduct of that alignment, a ripple from a soul in tune with the eternal. Write in the comments, I'm also on this path. There's a quiet power in the realization that we are not separate from creation. We are part of it, not passive recipients of divine grace, but active participants in its expression. Cayce didn't just suggest that Jesus had a unique relationship with God. He revealed that Jesus remembered something fundamental, something we've all carried within us since the beginning, that we are not here to worship life from the sidelines. We are here to co-create with it. That truth changes everything. To remember that you are a co-creator with the divine is to shift your entire mindset. It's no longer about praying for permission or begging for miracles. It's about aligning with the deeper intelligence that flows through all things. It's about recognizing that every thought, every word, every intention ripples outward, that your consciousness has impact, that your inner world shapes the outer one. Jesus didn't come to monopolize that truth. He came to embody it so others could recognize it within themselves. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this remembrance isn't just spiritual, it's subversive. The moment you realize that divinity isn't handed down from a pulpit, but lives within you, the entire structure of external control begins to crack. Systems built on hierarchy, on intermediaries, on the idea that someone else must stand between you and God, they start to feel hollow. And for centuries, that's exactly what institutions feared, because awakening people to their inner power makes them impossible to dominate. This is the hidden tension beneath so many of history's religious and political dynamics. The Christ message, in its purest form, is not a call to obedience. It's a call to sovereignty. It says, you were born with divine intelligence. You were born with creative authority. And you were never meant to give that away in exchange for security or approval. Jesus didn't climb a ladder of power. He emptied himself, and in doing so, he accessed something no empire could manufacture: authentic spiritual authority. This is why his message remains so revolutionary, not because it created a new system, but because it offered a way out of all systems, back into direct connection. It's a message of empowerment wrapped in humility, of unity wrapped in personal responsibility, and it forces us to confront something uncomfortable, that maybe we've spent too long looking outside ourselves for what can only be unlocked within. Cayce didn't bring this forward to dismantle faith. He brought it forward to deepen it, to remind us that what Jesus showed wasn't meant to be preserved in stained glass or sermons, but lived, felt, and expressed through the everyday choices we make, through how we speak to ourselves, through how we treat the person in front of us, through the quiet moments when we choose peace over chaos, love over fear, truth over comfort. Put down, "I'm also on this path." When you begin to peel back the layers of what we've been taught about salvation, something remarkable comes into focus. According to Cayce, Jesus was never asking to be placed on a pedestal. He wasn't seeking devotion for the sake of reverence. What he offered wasn't about hierarchy, it was about invitation. An invitation to step into the very awareness he had cultivated through lifetimes. An invitation to participate in divinity, not simply observe it from a distance. That changes everything. Because participation demands presence. It asks for inner work. It means salvation is not some external transaction handed down in reward for obedience, but a sacred remembering, a soul-level realization of who you've always been beneath the conditioning, the fear, the roles. Cayce didn't frame salvation as an escape from punishment, but as a return to essence, to the divine truth that's been with you all along, quietly, waiting to be seen again. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this idea, that we're not becoming divine but remembering our divinity, reframes our entire journey. It means we didn't start this life from scratch. We're not empty vessels waiting to be filled. We are ancient beings, each carrying threads of soul memory that stretch far beyond the stories we currently live. Cayce's readings suggest that every soul existed long before this particular lifetime began, and not just in some passive, formless state, but in conscious relationship with the Source. That means the challenges you face, the relationships you're drawn into, the longings that keep tugging at your heart, they aren't random. They're echoes, reminders, nudges from the part of you that knows, the part that's already walked through other worlds, other lives, and came back here not to start over, but to continue, to awaken, to integrate. When Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven being within, he wasn't being poetic, he was being precise. And Cayce's insights illuminate what that really means, that the divine is not an external prize to chase, but an internal presence to awaken. It's not about reaching for something you lack, it's about clearing what stands in the way of what's already there. This is why Jesus's path resonates on such a deep, almost cellular level, because he didn't just come to reveal what God is, he came to show what you are, when you're no longer asleep to your origin. His journey was a mirror, not of perfection, but of possibility, and in every moment he chose love over fear, truth over comfort, awareness over illusion. He was showing us what it looks like to live awake, and if we've lived before, if we carry soul memory that spans beyond what we consciously recall, then this path of remembrance is not unfamiliar. It's encoded in us. We've walked beside light before. We've known truth. We've forgotten it, yes. But deep down, we know the way back. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." When you strip away the centuries of dogma, the rigid interpretations, and the institutional frameworks built around fear, what remains is something astonishingly simple and incredibly powerful. Jesus wasn't sent to judge the world. He came to heal it, and not through condemnation or control, but through presence, through compassion, through remembering. Cayce's vision reveals this with startling clarity. The Christ was not a gatekeeper. He was a guide, a soul who had walked the path, felt its weight, and returned with hands open, not to divide, but to illuminate. This is more than a shift in theology. It's a complete transformation in how we relate to divinity. We've been taught to fear judgment, to brace ourselves against punishment. But what if the one we've been taught to fear wasn't holding a sword, but a mirror? What if the message wasn't, "Become worthy," but, "Remember who you are"? That's the kind of healing Jesus offered. Not bandages for behavior, but deep restoration of soul identity. Not temporary relief, but eternal remembrance. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the implication of this shift touches every part of our daily lives. If Jesus was a healer and not a judge, then the spiritual path is not about proving yourself. It's about becoming whole again. And if his miracles were not meant as historical trophies but living templates, then they were never meant to stay in the past. They were meant to multiply through us. Each one an invitation, not a conclusion. Healing isn't something reserved for a bygone era. It's not limited to biblical pages. It happens now, in the moment you choose forgiveness over resentment, clarity over confusion, compassion over control. Cayce didn't describe Jesus' acts as divine exceptions. He framed them as the natural result of alignment with truth. And that alignment wasn't exclusive. It's accessible. That's the hidden truth so many missed. Jesus didn't close the door behind him. He held it open. But holding a door is one thing. Walking through it is another. And that's where transformation takes place. Not in admiration, but in action. Not in worship, but in embodiment. When we start to ask how we can live with that same clarity of love, that same vision of wholeness, the miracles begin again. Not as spectacles, but as quiet shifts in consciousness, as moments when the divine leaks into the ordinary and reminds us that it never left. To follow that path means shedding the idea of being unworthy. It means releasing the programming that says only a few can access the sacred. Because if the Christ came to guide, then guidance is ongoing. And if healing is the expression of that guidance, then it begins where judgment ends. Right where you are. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." It's not difficult to understand why the version of Jesus that Cayce presented was quietly dismissed or outright rejected by many religious institutions. A Christ who empowers instead of controls, who points inward rather than demands allegiance, who says you too instead of only me. That kind of message doesn't fit easily within the structures built around authority. Because awakening, unlike obedience, cannot be measured, taxed, or manipulated. It arises from within, in its own time, in its own rhythm. And that kind of freedom? It's untamable. Mystery has always made people uneasy, especially those who benefit from certainty. The idea that Jesus didn't come to establish a rule book but to ignite a remembrance strikes at the foundation of every system built on hierarchy. When people awaken to their own connection with the divine, they stop outsourcing their power. They stop needing a middleman to interpret God for them. And that changes everything, not just spiritually, but culturally, politically, personally. It's not chaos. It's truth reclaiming its place. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because Cayce's version of Jesus doesn't let us sit comfortably in passive belief. It calls us to soul work. It asks us to go beyond mental agreement and move into transformation, the kind that takes place in how we forgive, not just others, but ourselves. The kind that shows up in service, not out of guilt or obligation, but because we recognize we are extensions of the same divine source. The kind that heals, not just through supernatural moments, but through presence, through stillness, through the courage to face our own shadows. This is the journey of becoming, not merely believing, and that difference is massive. Belief can sit safely in the mind. Becoming requires the heart, the will, the body, the decisions made in quiet moments no one else sees. That's where the Christ within begins to emerge, not in a flash of light, but in the moment you choose compassion over retaliation, understanding over judgment, healing over harm. Cayce's Jesus isn't asking you to worship from afar. He's inviting you to participate, to live what you claim to believe, to make the teachings real, not in theory, but in the way you move through this world. And that's not always easy. It requires us to let go of the illusion that someone else is responsible for our spiritual development. It asks us to take the journey inward, to do the inner excavation, to clear space for something sacred to awaken. And yet, in that invitation, there's something deeply liberating, because it means you're not waiting for permission. You're not broken, waiting to be fixed. You are being asked to remember, to strip away what was never truly you, and let the divine within rise to the surface again. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." There's something profoundly comforting, yet deeply activating about the idea that your relationship with the divine didn't start when you learned to pray, or when someone handed you a holy book. According to Cayce, It began long before breath ever entered your body. This dialogue between soul and source is not bound by time. It doesn't begin at birth or end at death. It moves like a current, always flowing, always whispering, always inviting you back to something ancient and alive inside you. And the more we slow down and tune in, the more clearly we begin to hear it. This isn't a conversation held in words. It's held in resonance, in the way you're pulled toward peace after conflict, in the moments of stillness that seem to stretch beyond time, in the ache you feel when truth brushes against the surface of your awareness. Cayce's Jesus reminds us that this is where the real communion happens, not in ritual alone, not in public display, but in the quiet chambers of the heart, where nothing needs to be proven, and everything is simply remembered. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this act of remembering is not a passive recollection. It's an awakening. It's the soul gently shedding everything it was never meant to carry. The beliefs, the fears, the conditioning that told you divinity was somewhere else, or that you had to earn it. The truth Cayce's Jesus points to is simple, but radical. You already are what you're seeking. The sacred is not distant. It's encoded within you, not as a metaphor, but as a living reality. That's what makes this teaching so powerful, and also so disruptive, because it bypasses dogma. It doesn't require a middleman. It doesn't demand you adopt a label. It simply asks you to feel, to remember, and that kind of transformation can't be commodified. It's not neatly packaged. It doesn't come with certainty. It comes with surrender, with courage, with a willingness to sit in silence long enough to hear what your soul has been trying to say all along. And the moment you begin to listen, truly listen, you'll find that you were never disconnected to begin with. You were just distracted, pulled in 100 directions by a world that profits from your forgetfulness. But the spark never left. It's still there, beneath the surface of your daily life, waiting to be fanned into flame again. Cayce's Jesus doesn't ask you to become someone new. He calls you back to who you've always been, not in theory but in lived experience, in how you show up, in how you love, in how you choose to see yourself, not as a sinner to be saved, but as a soul to be remembered. And when you begin to live from that space, everything shifts, not because you've added something, but because you've finally come home. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." If you've made it all the way here, I imagine something in this message resonated with you, maybe not just as information, but as something deeper, something remembered. That's what this space is for. So if this kind of content speaks to you, you might want to subscribe, just so you don't miss the next time we peel back another layer together. And if you're still with me right now, drop a comment with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end." It lets me know you felt the thread all the way through. And trust me, that connection means something here. Go ahead and leave a like too, if this conversation stirred something in you. It's a simple gesture, but it helps keep these kinds of messages reaching the people who might just need to hear them next. There's a video right here that complements everything we've just explored. Click and continue with me over there. Let's keep going.